Margaret Calloway found her own name missing from the family table. Not misplaced, not forgotten, deliberately removed. She walked the length of the head table twice, her fingers trembling against the embossed place cards, her heart slamming against the whalebone corset her mother had laced so tight she couldn't draw a full breath. Every Preston name was there except hers. Then she saw it, a small card at the overflow table behind the pillar, wedged between the disgraced and the forgotten, bearing her name in her mother's handwriting. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The place card was the size of a playing card and the weight of a gravestone. Margaret Calloway stood at the far left end of the head table of the Hargrove Grand Hotel, her dark eyes moving over the embossed white cards one final time. Edmund Calloway, Dorothea Calloway, Eliza Calloway, Harlan Calloway, a blank reserved card for the Chicago investor. She had already walked the right side of the table. She had already checked twice. She walked it a third time because her mind refused to accept what her eyes were telling her. Her name was not there. Around her, the Founders' Reunion Feast of Copper Ridge, Montana, was filling to capacity. The year was 1888. The Blackwood Valley's wealthiest families were settling into their assigned seats with the practiced efficiency of people who had attended too many important dinners to be impressed by any of them. Crystal clinked. Silk rustled. Men in tailored broadcloth suits laughed at each other's jokes with the specific hollow laughter of people performing happiness rather than feeling it. Margaret stood frozen at the edge of the dais. "Looking for something, cousin?" The voice belonged to Prudence Whitmore, her mother's niece, who was arranging herself into a chair at the table, just below the elevated head platform. Prudence had the sharp, pretty features of a woman who had never once doubted her own worth and never intended to start. "My place card," Margaret said, keeping her voice flat. "I seem to have misplaced it." Prudence tilted her head, a slow, satisfied smile, pulling at the corners of her painted mouth. "Oh, I don't believe you misplaced anything, Margaret. Your mother made some adjustments this year. So many important guests, you understand. The head table was simply overcrowded." She paused, letting the cruelty ripen before she delivered it. "I believe she found a more suitable arrangement for you." Prudence raised one gloved finger and pointed toward the back of the grand room, past the towering mahogany columns, past the second tier of family tables, all the way to the narrow wooden doors that led to the hotel kitchens. Tucked behind a thick structural pillar that blocked the view of nearly the entire hall, sat a small round overflow table. The tablecloth didn't match the hotel's white linen. The chairs were mismatched. Seated there were two governesses speaking quietly to each other, an elderly great-uncle who had lost his mining fortune in a bad investment 7 years prior, and a disbarred attorney named Horace Finch, who attended every social event in Copper Ridge, because no one had yet found the courage to formally uninvite him. Margaret's place card sat in the dead center of that table, written in her mother's precise, deliberate script. She felt the blood leave her face. It was not an oversight. Oversights were accidents. This was architecture. Her mother had spent weeks planning every detail of the Founders' Feast, down to the placement of the autumn centerpieces, and she had taken the time to write Margaret's name on a card and personally place it at the shame table, hidden from the sight of the Chicago investors, tucked behind a pillar where no one would have to look at her. Margaret became aware that people were watching. The whispers started the way they always did, low and boneless, slithering from table to table. "Did you see Dorothea finally did it?" "Well, you can't blame her. Clara needs this season to go perfectly." "The poor thing. But honestly, in that dress, you'd think she'd have made some effort." Margaret's hands closed into fists at her sides. The emerald fabric of her gown pulled tight across her knuckles. The corset her mother had spent 3 days engineering bit into her lower ribs with every shallow breath she managed. She had not eaten since morning because Dorothea had insisted the structural integrity of the whalebone required it. She was 31 years old, and her mother still managed her body like livestock before a county fair. The urge to walk out was overwhelming, not the composed, dignified departure of a woman who had decided she deserved better. The blind, humiliated flight of a woman who simply could not endure one more second of being publicly measured against herself and found catastrophically lacking. She wanted to push through the double doors at the back of the hall and keep walking until the hotel lights disappeared behind her, and there was nothing left but cold Montana air and the sound of the Blackwood River somewhere in the dark. Her legs didn't move. If she ran, they would laugh. If she sat at the overflow table, she confirmed everything they believed about her. There was no path through this room that did not cost her something she could not afford to lose. She was still standing in the main aisle, frozen between two impossible choices, when the silence fell. It started at the entrance, a pocket of quiet where the chatter had been, and then it spread forward through the room like a wave. Table by table, the laughter dying. The conversations dropping off the clink of glasses, stopping until the only sounds left were the hiss of the gas lamps and the distant pop of the fireplace logs. Margaret turned around. Colton Hayes stood in the arched doorway of the dining hall. She had heard of him. Everyone in the Blackwood Valley had heard of Colton Hayes. He controlled the northern passes through the Bitterroot Range, the only viable routes for getting timber down from the high country before the winter snows made the roads impassable. He had built his empire quietly and almost invisibly, acquiring land grants and copper rights and railroad easements, while men like her father were busy throwing parties to celebrate wealth they hadn't quite finished accumulating. The town's elite spoke about him the way people spoke about weather patterns and acts of God, with grudging respect for something they could not control. He did not look like a man who belonged in a ballroom. He was enormous, well over 6 feet, with the kind of broad, hard-built frame that came from years of actual physical work, rather than the fashionable posturing of men who owned gymnasiums they never entered. His coat was dark oiled leather over a charcoal waistcoat, his collar open at the throat, his dark hair touching his collar, a heavy beard framing a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite as the mountains he lived on. His eyes were a startling slate gray, the color of storm clouds over the peaks, and they moved across the room with a slow, methodical precision that missed nothing. He smelled of pine resin and cold air and wood smoke, and the scent reached Margaret even from a distance, sharp and clean against the suffocating mixture of French perfume and cigar smoke that ruled the hall. Up on the dais, Harlan Calloway scrambled to his feet so fast he nearly knocked over his wine glass. "Mr. Hayes." His voice came out too loud, the voice of a man performing delight for an audience. "Good God, what an unexpected honor. Please come forward. Come forward." Colton Hayes did not look at Harlan Calloway. His slate gray eyes swept the room, once taking in the opulent head table, the elevated dais, the hierarchy of assigned seating, and then they stopped. They stopped on Margaret. She felt the heat of his gaze like a physical thing, a pressure against her sternum, and she straightened instinctively, her chin coming up a fraction of an inch, her hands releasing their grip on each other. She expected what always happened next. She expected his gaze to assess her for approximately half a second, and then slide past her to land on Eliza, who was seated at the head table in a gown the color of winter roses, batting her lashes at the investor from Chicago. Colton Hayes did not look at Eliza. He began to walk down the center aisle. The crowd shifted instinctively, chairs scraping back, people pulling their arms in, creating a path through sheer animal instinct. His boots were heavy on the hardwood floor. The sound carried. On the dais, Dorothea Calloway rose from her chair, her smile sliding into place with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of strategic social warmth. "Mr. Hayes," she called out, pitching her voice to Carrie. "We are so delighted you came. We have a seat right here beside my daughter Eliza. Please join us at the front." Eliza sat up straighter. She touched the pearl buttons at her collar, arranged her expression into something that she had practiced in a mirror and believed was modest, and aimed it directly at the man walking toward her. Colton Hayes walked past her without a glance. He walked the full length of the aisle and stopped when he was standing less than 2 feet from Margaret. Up close, he was more imposing than she had prepared herself for, radiating a contained physical warmth that cut through the chill of the hall. She stared at the third button of his waistcoat, and did not look up. "Evening, ma'am." His voice was low and rough like gravel shifting under slow water, but there was nothing rough in the way he said it. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes," Margaret managed. She took a small automatic step backward, assuming he needed her to clear the aisle so he could proceed to the head table where important men were waiting for him. He didn't move. She felt him looking at the place cards on the nearby tables. She felt the moment his gaze traveled to the back of the room, found the overflow table behind the pillar, read her name on the card sitting in the center of it. She felt the silence that followed that recognition settle over him like a storm system making landfall. "Don't believe we've been introduced," Colton said. "I'm Colton Hayes." Margaret forced herself to look up. His face was weathered in the honest way of men who spent their lives outdoors, and his expression was entirely uncomplicatedly focused on her. There was no pity in it. There was no performance of sympathy. There was something else, something that looked disturbingly like genuine attention, and Margaret had so little experience of that particular thing that she almost didn't recognize it. "Margaret Calloway," she said. Her voice shook slightly on the second word. She hated herself for it. "Miss Calloway." He gave a brief, formal incline of his head. "Pleasure." "Mr. Hayes." Harlan Calloway appeared at the edge of the dais, sweating through his collar, his smile stretched past the point of credibility. "Please, let's not stand in the aisle. We have the finest cuts at the front, and I have a great deal I'd like to discuss with you regarding the Northern Pass easements." Colton turned his head toward Harlan with the unhurried patience of a man who has never once felt the need to rush anything. "I'm not here to talk business tonight, Harlan." Of course, of course." Harlan laughed a laugh that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Eliza would be absolutely delighted to have you beside her. She's been looking forward to—" "I reckon I'll choose my own company," Colton said. He turned back to Margaret. He extended his hand between them, palm up, unhurried, and entirely steady. His hand was large and calloused, and marked with the kind of small old scars that came from actual work, and it did not waver. "Miss Calloway," Colton said, his voice carrying clearly into the deafening quiet of the room. "I find I've got no interest in sitting with people who don't know the value of the company they keep. Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner?" The sound that went through the grand hall was not quite a gasp, and not quite silence. It was the sound of an entire room recalibrating. On the dais, Dorothea Calloway set down her crystal goblet with a click that was almost loud enough to be a statement. The color left her face in a single visible tide. Beside her, Eliza's carefully constructed expression of modest beauty crumpled into something far less lovely. At the far end of the table, Edmund Calloway, who had been deep in conversation with Fletcher Crane, the banking investor from Chicago, looked up and went very still. Margaret stared at the offered hand. Her mind moved fast and desperate through all the reasons this was impossible. Men like Colton Hayes did not see women like Margaret Calloway. They looked through them, or around them, or occasionally at them with the specific detached pity one might feel for a lame horse. They did not stand in the center of the most important social event of the Valley's year and offer their hand in front of 200 witnesses. It didn't happen. It wasn't the shape the world was built in. She cast one involuntary glance toward her mother. Dorothea's eyes were wide and hot, and they said with absolute clarity and without a single word, "Do not you dare." Margaret looked back at Colton's hand. "They didn't set a place for me at the front, Mr. Hayes," she said quietly. The shame of saying it out loud burned all the way up her throat. "My table is in the back." "I saw," Colton said. His voice dropped just for her. Then it rose again steady and unapologetic. "Then we'll make one." He didn't wait for her to argue further. He closed his fingers gently but completely around her hand and tucked it into the crook of his arm. And the physical solidity of him was so unexpected and so anchoring that Margaret felt something in her chest shift, some long-held tension releasing like a rope finally cut. They walked together down the length of the aisle. She could hear the whispers erupting on both sides of them, a wall of scandalized sound, and she kept her eyes forward and her chin at a level she had to consciously maintain, and she did not look at a single watching face. When they reached the dais, Harlan stepped into their path. "Mr. Hayes, I must strongly insist. You won't insist on a damn thing tonight, Harlan." Colton's voice dropped an octave. It was not loud. It was the kind of quiet that made the air around it go still. Harlan stopped. Colton released Margaret's arm for 30 seconds. He moved to the head table, lifted the heavy carved oak chair that had been placed for Fletcher Crane, and relocated it to the dead center of the table between Edmund and Dorothea Calloway. Then he reached for Eliza's chair, and Eliza let out a high, sharp sound of pure indignation as she was displaced 2 feet down the table without ceremony. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" Dorothea's composure finally cracked, not all at once, but in pieces like ice breaking on a spring river. Colton ignored her. He turned back to Margaret, his hand on the back of the repositioned chair. "Your seat, Miss Calloway," he said. His eyes held hers, and dared anyone in the room to challenge it. Margaret sat down. The velvet of the chair was warm, and the room had gone so quiet, she could hear the small, frantic ticking of the gold pocket watch against her father's waistcoat. She sat at the center of the head table of the Founders' Reunion Feast of Copper Ridge, Montana, between her mother's barely contained fury on the left and the immovable presence of Colton Hayes on the right, and she did not allow herself to shake. "Mr. Hayes." Edmund Calloway's voice was tight with the specific restraint of a man holding himself together through sheer social training. "This is highly irregular. Mr. Crane was meant to sit in that chair. The seating was arranged weeks in advance to accommodate." "Crane can find another chair," Colton said. He reached for the whiskey carafe and poured himself a measure with the unhurried ease of a man sitting in his own kitchen. "Or the floor. I don't particularly care." "The optics of this," Harlan began. "The optics," Colton said, cutting him off without raising his voice, "are that I'm having dinner with Miss Calloway. If that's a problem for anyone at this table, I can easily take my business and my mountain passes to the logging operations in Idaho. I hear they're quite eager for a northern route." The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence that had come before it. Edmund Calloway's jaw worked. He looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the tablecloth. Fletcher Crane, who had been quietly relocated to a secondary seat and was clearly beginning to understand something about the nature of this evening that the other men had not yet fully grasped, said nothing at all. Edmund gave a stiff nod to the hovering waitstaff. Service began. The first course arrived, a rich butternut squash soup, and Margaret had barely lifted her spoon when Dorothea leaned toward her, her voice pitched low enough that the words were meant only for her daughter's ears. "Don't touch the bread, Margaret. We discussed what Madame Fontaine said about the structural limits of that corset. The last thing we need is a scene in front of Mr. Crane." The familiar shame rose in Margaret's chest like floodwater. She put down her spoon. Her hands moved to her lap. The old habit, the retreat, the disappearing act she had been performing at this table for 2 decades was already in motion before she had consciously decided to perform it. Then a large, calloused hand covered hers beneath the tablecloth. It didn't squeeze. It simply rested there, warm and immovable, a weight that said, "I see what you were about to do, and you do not have to do it." Margaret's breath caught. She looked up. Colton had not moved his upper body. He was looking out over the room with the relaxed authority of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin, but beneath the table his hand was steady over hers. "Nonsense, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his tone conversational and perfectly pleasant, as though Dorothea had offered a mildly interesting opinion about the weather. "A woman ought to eat. The mountains don't have much use for things that break in the wind. I've always found a healthy appetite is the sign of a strong constitution." He turned to Margaret, his gray eyes warm in a way that contradicted the hard lines of his face, and his thumb brushed once across her knuckles before he withdrew his hand. "Isn't that right, Miss Calloway?" "Yes, Mr. Hayes." Margaret said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She picked up her spoon. She took a bite of the soup. It was the finest thing she had ever tasted, not because the hotel kitchen had done something remarkable with butternut squash, but because of the sheer quiet defiance of the act itself. Across the table, Fletcher Crane leaned forward with the eager energy of a man who had decided the best way to survive a volatile evening was to redirect it toward business. Mr. Hayes, regarding the geological surveys of Blackwood Ridge, our engineers have serious concerns about the granite density for the proposed rail switchbacks. We may need to consider blasting through the lower gorge as an alternative route. Edmund and Harlan nodded with the solemn authority of men who had not read the engineering reports. Colton took a slow, measured bite of his food. Lower gorge is unstable shale, Crane. You put a dynamite charge down there, you'll bring half the mountain onto your own tracks. The Federal Survey maps suggest otherwise, Crane countered smoothly. The words were out of Margaret's mouth before she had completed the decision to speak them. The federal maps are from 1874, she said. They were drawn before the tremor of 1881 shifted the subterranean aquifer system. The shale in the lower gorge is currently saturated. Any significant concussive force would trigger a catastrophic failure of the entire eastern face. Mr. Hayes is correct. The table went still. Edmund stared at his eldest daughter as though she had just spoken in a language he did not recognize. Harlan blinked. Eliza, from her displaced position further down the table, looked genuinely confused, the way people look when something outside the boundaries of their understanding occurs without warning. Dorothea's voice came out like a blade. Abigail, you will hold your tongue. She knows nothing of geology or business. She reads too many periodicals and fancies herself educated. Pay her no mind, Mr. Crane. Colton put down his fork. He turned his body toward Dorothea, not quickly, not with heat, but with the deliberate weight of a man who has decided something and will not be moved from it. Mrs. Calloway, he said, if you interrupt her again, I'll have you removed from your own table. Dorothea's mouth opened, closed. She clutched the pearl strand at her throat with white-knuckled fingers and said nothing. Colton turned back to Margaret. The storm that had briefly darkened his expression cleared completely, and what replaced it was something that made the breath stop in Margaret's lungs because she had never once seen it directed at her. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something rare. Tell me about the aquifers, Miss Calloway, he said. And for the next 20 minutes, the most powerful men in Copper Ridge, Montana sat in humiliated silence while Colton Hayes gave Margaret Calloway the floor, and she used every inch of it. She had been reading the Denver Geological Review for 4 years. She had been summarizing the university engineering journals for her father since she was 23, because Edmund Calloway had no patience for the technical sections, and she had been raised to make herself useful. She knew the tremor data. She knew the subterranean water tables. She knew exactly where the stable granite lay and where it did not. She knew all of it, and no one had ever once asked her to say it out loud. Colton asked her questions. Real questions, specific and technical. The questions of a man who understood the subject and wanted to understand it better. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table, his gray eyes entirely focused, and he listened to her the way people listen, when what they are hearing actually matters to them. Margaret felt the emerald gown, the too tight corset, the pinned and severe arrangement of her dark hair, all of it fell away. What remained was simply her mind, her knowledge, the years of quiet, solitary reading that her family had treated as eccentricity, suddenly legitimate and valued, and real. By the time the dessert plates were being cleared, and the orchestra was beginning its setup in the cleared center of the hall, something had taken root in Margaret Calloway's chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It would take her another few minutes to recognize it as pride. She had almost forgotten what it felt like. The pride lasted exactly as long as it took for the hotel staff to begin clearing the dinner tables. The moment the dessert plates disappeared and the orchestra struck its first tuning notes, the careful architecture of the evening shifted. The rigid formality of the feast dissolved into the looser, more dangerous social current of a ball, and with it came the unraveling of whatever protection the dinner table had provided. People began to move. Conversations reformed into new configurations. The hierarchy of the room reshuffled itself, and in that reshuffling, Margaret felt the exposure of her position with sudden acute clarity. She had sat at the center of the head table for 2 hours. She had spoken in front of Edmund Callaway's business associates. She had contradicted a Chicago banking investor and been publicly defended by the most powerful man in the territory. Every single person in that room had watched it happen, and every single one of them was now deciding what to do with what they had seen. Margaret could feel the decision being made about her from across the room. She could see it in the way people angled their bodies in the small rapid exchanges between women who had known her mother for 20 years, in the way the younger wives touched each other's arms and leaned close. The Whisper network of Copper Ridge Society was the most efficient communication system in the valley, faster than the telegraph and considerably more destructive. She needed air. She needed a wall at her back and 4 minutes without anyone looking at her. She slipped away from the dais during the commotion of the table removal, moving along the edge of the room toward the narrow corridor that led to the hotel's rear garden. The adrenaline that had carried her through dinner was metabolizing fast, leaving behind a trembling, exposed rawness that she did not want anyone to witness. Her mind was turning over Colton Hayes with the same relentless focus it applied to geological surveys, looking for the flaw in the data, the calculation error that would explain what had actually happened tonight. Men like Colton Hayes did not see women like Margaret Callaway. That was not bitterness. That was simply the observed reality of 24 years of social experience. She was not Clara. She was not Eliza with her golden ringlets and her 20-inch waist and her high-carrying laugh that made every man in a room feel as though he had just said something remarkably clever. Margaret was large and plain, and she had always known it with the clear-eyed honesty of a woman who had stopped hoping the mirror would change its mind. So what had tonight been, if not what it appeared? She had nearly reached the corridor door when the answer came for her. "Margaret." The voice was her mother's, stripped of every social grace it normally wore, reduced to its bare hissing core. Margaret stopped walking. She did not turn around immediately. She took one breath, squared the weight of what was coming against the structure of her spine, and turned. Dorothea Callaway was crossing the edge of the ballroom toward her with the focused momentum of a woman who had been waiting for this moment since the soup course. She had Eliza with her. Eliza, whose expression had hardened into something far less decorative than her usual performance of sweetness. Behind them, the ballroom continued its noise and movement, oblivious. Dorothea closed the distance between them and took Margaret's upper arm in her hand. Her grip was precise and practiced, the grip of a woman who had learned long ago exactly how much pressure was required to move a person without leaving a visible mark. "Do you have any idea?" Dorothea said, her voice pulled so tight it barely had room to breathe. "What you have done tonight? Do you have any conception of the damage you have caused to this family in the last 2 hours?" "I sat at a table, Mother," Margaret said. "I ate dinner." "Don't you dare." Dorothea's fingers tightened on her arm. "You did not simply sit at a table. You made a spectacle of yourself in front of Fletcher Crane and every founding family in this valley. You contradicted a man of business in public. I was correct," Margaret said. "About the aquifer, about the shale formation, I was correct, and Mr. Crane knows it." "It does not matter if you were correct." The words came out of Dorothea like something that had been stored under pressure for a very long time. "It has never mattered whether you were correct, Margaret. What matters is the impression this family makes on the people who control our future. And the impression you made tonight was of a desperate, embarrassing woman who clung to a powerful man's attention like a drowning stray." The words hit with the precision her mother had always had, finding the exact places that had never fully healed and pressing into them without mercy. Eliza made a small sound beside her mother, something between a laugh and a confirmation, and Margaret felt the familiar undertow begin the slow, suffocating pull of shame that she had been fighting her entire life. She felt her shoulders begin to round forward. She felt her chin begin to drop. 31 years of practiced smallness reasserting itself with muscle memory. He doesn't want you, Margaret. Dorothea's voice dropped further, becoming almost intimate in its cruelty. A man like Colton Hayes uses people. He used you tonight to put pressure on your father, to make Edmund feel the instability of his position before the business negotiations begin. You were a prop, you were a convenient tool, and you sat there with that look on your face, that desperate, grateful look, and let him use you in front of everyone we know. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Let me go home, Mother," she said. "I'll take the back way. No one will see me leave." "You absolutely will not," Dorothea said. "You will go back into that ballroom. You will sit somewhere unobtrusive, and you will say nothing to anyone for the remainder of the evening while Eliza repairs the impression that your behavior tonight has damaged. Do you understand me? Clara needs this season to go cleanly. One proposal, Margaret. That's all we need. One proposal from one decent man, and you will not ruin it." "Clara?" Margaret said. Her voice was very quiet. "Her name is Eliza." Dorothea blinked. "Eliza?" Dorothea corrected without a pause, without a flicker of acknowledgement that she had just called her eldest daughter by her youngest daughter's name from 7 years prior. A daughter who had died of fever in the summer of 1881 and whose existence the family had spent most of the intervening years declining to discuss. Something cracked open in Margaret's chest at that. Something old and deep and long ignored. "I am not going back into that ballroom," Margaret said. "I beg your pardon. I said I'm not going back in." She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like something past courage, something that comes after a person has been afraid for so long that the fear has finally worn itself smooth. "You hid my name behind a pillar tonight, Mother. You wrote it on a card and put it at the overflow table, and you expected me to sit there quietly and be grateful I was included at all. I'm not going back in to sit in a corner so that Eliza can find a husband without my existence complicating the aesthetic." Dorothea's face underwent a transformation. The controlled social mask dissolved completely, and what emerged underneath was not the cold fury Margaret had expected. It was something rawer than that. It was the specific frightened rage of a woman whose plan was failing and who did not have a contingency. "You ungrateful! That will be about enough of that." The voice came from behind them low and unhurried, and all three women went still. Colton Hayes was leaning against the wall of the corridor in the recessed shadow of a doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his slate-gray eyes moving between Dorothea and Eliza with an expression that made the temperature in the hallway drop by several degrees. Margaret did not know how long he had been there. Long enough. His jaw was set in a way that told her he had heard most of what had been said, and that he had filed it carefully and intended to do something precise with it. He pushed off the wall and walked toward them, and Dorothea took an involuntary step back, pulling Eliza with her. "Mr. Hayes." Dorothea began scrambling to reassemble the social apparatus. "We were simply having a private family." "I heard what you were having," Colton said. He stopped placing himself between Dorothea and Margaret with the natural, unhurried deliberateness of a man positioning a wall. He did not look at Margaret yet. He kept his eyes on Dorothea. "Let me be clear about something, Mrs. Calloway. I don't use people. I don't conduct business through humiliation. And I don't spend my time talking to women I don't respect." He paused, letting that settle. "I came to the feast tonight because I have been watching your daughter for 3 months. Dorothea made a sound that had no name in polite vocabulary. 3 months ago. Colton continued, his voice even and without heat, which somehow made it worse. "I saw Margaret standing outside Hartwell's Mercantile in the rain, reading a geological journal because Hartwell wouldn't let her sit inside. I watched her argue the tensile ratings on the new Blackwood River Bridge with the telegraph operator. I watched her carry herself through this town with a dignity that I personally would not have been able to maintain under the same circumstances." He finally glanced at Eliza briefly without warmth. "I've been to a great many frontier towns, Miss Calloway, and I have met a great many beautiful women. Beauty in a woman is not rare. Intelligence and strength of character are considerably harder to come by. Eliza's chin went up. Her eyes filled, whether from genuine hurt or social reflex, it was impossible to determine. Dorothea found her footing. Mr. Hayes, however well-intentioned you believe yourself to be, you do not understand the complexities of this family's situation. Margaret has always been too much, Colton said flatly. Dorothea stopped. That's the word, isn't it? Colton's voice had gone very quiet. Too large. Too outspoken. Too inconvenient. Too much of something that doesn't fit the picture you're trying to sell. He shook his head once, a small, disgusted movement. The problem with that assessment, Mrs. Calloway, is that it comes from a woman who put her own daughter's name on a card and hid it behind a pillar. I don't think your judgment on the subject of value is worth a great deal. Dorothea's hand came up. It happened fast, the reflexive, proprietary violence of a woman who had never once faced a consequence for reaching toward her eldest daughter with that particular intention. Her palm swung toward Margaret's cheek, and Colton's hand was there before it arrived. His fingers closing around Dorothea's wrist with an immovable, measured grip that stopped the motion entirely without force. Dorothea gasped. Eliza pressed her hand to her mouth. Colton held Dorothea's wrist for exactly as long as it took for her to understand that he was not going to release it until he had finished speaking. If you ever raise your hand to her again, he said, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur that was nonetheless the most authoritative sound in the corridor. I will not simply take your household accounts and your timber contracts, Mrs. Calloway. I will dismantle every social relationship you have cultivated in this valley for 30 years. I will do it methodically, and I will do it completely, and when I am finished, there will not be a founding family in the Blackwood Valley who will share a table with you. He released her wrist. Am I understood? Dorothea stumbled back. She was clutching her wrist to her chest heaving, her composure gone entirely. She looked for the first time in Margaret's living memory, genuinely frightened. Eliza moved to her mother's side and said nothing. Colton turned away from them both. He turned to Margaret, and the transformation in his expression was immediate and complete, the cold authority replaced by something quieter and more careful. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded handkerchief, linen, clean pressed. He offered it to her without a word. Margaret took it. She pressed it briefly to the corners of her eyes, not because she had been crying, but because the alternative was pressing it to her mouth to keep something less composed from escaping. She isn't wrong about all of it, Margaret said. Her voice was steady but barely. You did use me tonight in a sense. My presence at that table changed the dynamic of the room. My father felt it. Your presence beside me was a statement of leverage before it was anything else. She looked up at him. She wanted to see the flinch, the moment of recalibration where he remembered that she was perceptive, and that perception was occasionally inconvenient. Colton looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, but the specific respect a man shows when a person has said something accurate and difficult. You're right that it changed the room, he said. I won't tell you I didn't know it would, but that was not why I did it. He held her gaze. I did it because when I walked through those doors and saw you standing alone in that aisle with your hands clasped together, and your name missing from the table your family built, I was not able to walk past you and sit down to eat. I've done a great many things in my life for strategic reasons, Miss Calloway. That was not one of them. Margaret studied him. The flickering gas lamp at the end of the corridor threw uneven light across his face, and she catalogued him the way she catalogued geological data, methodically looking for inconsistency. She found his expression difficult to read, in the way that honest things were sometimes difficult to read, because they lacked the legibility of performance. The orchestra is playing, Colton said. I am aware of that. I would like to dance with you. Margaret felt a short, involuntary sound move through her chest. It was not a laugh exactly. It was the sound a person makes when the situation exceeds the available vocabulary for responding to it. Mr. Hayes, she said, I have never danced. Not once. I was not asked at my debut. I was not asked the year after. I have attended 9 of these reunions, and I have spent the dancing portion of every single one of them sitting in the exact kind of corner my mother has just instructed me to occupy. I know, Colton said. I heard. Colton. Then you understand why the suggestion is, I'll lead, he said simply. You won't have to do anything but hold on. She looked at him for a moment that stretched longer than she intended. Behind her, somewhere in the corridor, she could hear her mother saying something to Eliza in a low, fierce voice, regrouping, re-strategizing, returning to form. In the ballroom, the orchestra was fully into its first waltz, the sound drifting warm and golden through the walls. In 40 minutes, the dancing would end, and the evening would be over, and she would either take the back road home alone, or she would walk back into that ballroom. She thought about the place card behind the pillar. She thought about the corset that had not let her breathe properly since 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She thought about the soup she had eaten in defiance of her mother's instruction, the way the simple act of lifting a spoon had felt briefly like something approaching freedom. She thought about 9 years of corners. My mother will never forgive me, Margaret said. No, Colton agreed. She won't. The whole town will talk about this for months. They will, he said. They're already talking. She looked down at the handkerchief still folded in her hands. His initials were stitched into the corner in dark thread. CH plain and without ornamentation, the kind of monogram a man chose for himself rather than one selected by a social secretary. She looked up. I would like to dance Mr. Hayes, Margaret Calloway said. Her voice did not shake. She took his offered arm, and together they walked back down the corridor toward the blazing light of the ballroom, and she did not look back at her mother, not even once. The moment they stepped through the ballroom doors, the room did what rooms full of people always do when something unprecedented walks into them. It noticed, not all at once. It started at the edges, the way Margaret had watched the silence spread when Colton first arrived. But this time, it moved faster and carried a different quality. There was heat in it. The particular heat of a crowd that has spent 2 hours absorbing an unusual situation and has now been given a new and more dramatic development to process. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women touched their companions' arms without looking away from the dance floor. Colton walked her through the parted crowd without hesitation, without the performative awareness of a man who knew he was being watched and wanted credit for not caring. He simply walked his hand warm at the small of her back, his pace unhurried, his attention entirely on the floor ahead of them, rather than the faces surrounding them. Margaret kept her chin level. She focused on the middle distance and breathed through the corset in the shallow, measured way she had learned over years of wearing things designed to compress her into a more acceptable shape. They reached the edge of the cleared dance floor. The orchestra was 3 measures into a waltz, something slow and formal that the St. Louis musicians had brought with them like a calling card from a more civilized world. The couples already dancing made space without being asked, an instinctive social reflex in the presence of Colton Hayes that Margaret was beginning to recognize as simply the way rooms operated around him. He turned to face her. He held out his hand. Margaret looked at it for 1 second, a single beat of hesitation, and then she placed her hand in his. His other hand came to rest at her waist, not the careful, socially appropriate distance that frontier decorum required between unmarried persons, but close his arm firm and present, communicating through the simple physics of it that he intended to actually lead, rather than perform the suggestion of leading while she navigated alone. She felt the breadth of his chest against her shoulder. She felt the steadiness of him. I told you I've never done this, she said quietly. I heard you, he said. Follow my weight, not my feet. She did not entirely understand what that meant. But when he moved, she understood it instinctively. The shift of his center of gravity forward and to the left, carrying her with it, before her feet had consciously decided where to go. She was not graceful. She was not Eliza, who had been taking dancing instruction since she was 8 years old, and moved through waltzes with the liquid ease of someone for whom music had always been a native language. Margaret stumbled slightly on the second measure, and Colton's arm tightened and corrected, and did not make a single thing of it, and they kept moving. By the third rotation, she had stopped thinking about her feet. She became aware of something she had not anticipated, not the watching faces or the whispers threading through the crowd at the edges of the floor, but the strange, specific relief of being held by someone who did not require anything from her. Her mother's grip on her arm earlier in the corridor had been proprietary, purposeful, the grip of a woman managing an asset. Colton's hand at her waist asked nothing. It simply held. She had not known how exhausted she was until something stopped requiring her to carry her own weight alone. They came around on the third rotation past the edge of the elevated dais, and that was when Edmund Calloway stepped forward. Margaret felt Colton's hand tighten fractionally at her waist before she saw her father, a reflexive, protective adjustment that happened below the level of conscious decision. Edmund had left the head table. He was standing at the boundary of the dance floor with Fletcher Crane directly behind him, and his face had moved past the controlled fury of the dinner table into something rawer and less managed. "Hayes!" Edmund's voice cut through the music loud enough to turn heads among the nearest dancers. The orchestra did not stop, but it faltered slightly, the second violinist losing a beat. "This has gone far enough. Step away from my daughter." Colton brought them to a stop. He did not step away from Margaret. He kept his arm at her waist and turned his upper body toward her father, with the unhurried patience of a man who has been expecting this particular conversation. "Evening, Edmund," he said. "Do not evening me." Edmund's jaw was tight enough that the words came out slightly compressed. "I don't know what game you're running tonight, but it ends now. Whatever point you're trying to make to me about the past negotiations, you've made it. I understand the message. Now let go of my daughter, and we will sit down like reasonable men and discuss terms." "I'm not making a point about the past negotiations," Colton said. "Then what the hell are you doing?" "Dancing with Margaret." Edmund stared at him. Behind Edmund, Crane had taken a small, careful step to the side, the posture of a man deciding that physical distance from the center of this conversation was a sound investment. "You are making a spectacle of my family," Edmund said, his voice dropping, but not softening. "You are undermining my standing in front of every business contact I have in this valley. You are dancing with an unmarried daughter of this house in front of 200 witnesses, without my permission or knowledge, and I am telling you now that if you do not step away from her, the timber contract is finished. I will pull every easement application off your desk by Monday morning." Colton was quiet for a moment. He looked at Edmund with the expression of a man examining something that had confirmed a prior assessment. "You can't pull the easements," Colton said. "And you can't kill the timber contract." Edmund's eyes narrowed. "I own Blackwood Timber, Hayes. I think I can determine what—" "You own 40% of Blackwood Timber," Colton said. "You sold the controlling interest to a Chicago holding company 14 months ago to cover the losses from the Northern Gorge survey. The holding company is called Meridian Land and Capital." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, the final patience of a man who has been carrying a long weight and has decided to set it down. "I am Meridian Land and Capital Edmund. I have been for 11 months. The orchestra finished its waltz. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of dancers resting between pieces. It was the silence of a room that has stopped breathing. Edmund Calloway did not move. He stood at the edge of the dance floor, with the frozen quality of a man whose internal architecture has just undergone a structural failure, the outside still standing while everything load-bearing inside has given way. His mouth opened, closed. "That's," he started, stopped. "That's not possible." "I have the purchase documentation at my estate," Colton said. "You're welcome to review it Monday morning. My attorney will be available." He looked briefly at Crane. "Mr. Crane is aware. He's been managing the Meridian accounts for the past 8 months. Isn't that right, Fletcher?" Crane had gone the specific color of a man who wishes he were in a different city. He did not look at Edmund. He looked at a fixed point somewhere between the dance floor and the nearest exit and said with tremendous precision, "That is correct." Edmund turned to look at Crane with the expression of a man watching the last wall of his house fall. Harlan appeared at Edmund's shoulder, moving through the crowd with the frantic energy of someone who had heard enough from a nearby table to know that the situation had deteriorated beyond repair. His face was a mottled red, and he was sweating through his collar in a way that would have been visible from the back of the room. "Now see here," Harlan said, directing this at Colton with the specific bluster of a man who knows he has no actual authority but cannot stop performing the impression of it. "You cannot walk into a private family event and make these kinds of accusations in front of polite company. This is slander, Hayes. This is deliberate provocation, and I will have the county sheriff," Harlan Colton said, with the patient tone of a man addressing someone he finds moderately tedious. "I bought your personal debt from the First Territorial Bank of Helena 6 months ago. The promissory note for the expansion of your grazing leases. $12,000 at 9% due in full by April of next year." He held Harlan's gaze. "You'd be wise to lower your voice." Harlan's mouth closed. He looked at Edmund. Edmund was still staring at the floor. The crowd had pressed inward without anyone consciously deciding to move. Margaret could feel the weight of 200 people leaning toward the center of the room, hungry for the resolution of something that had been building since the moment Colton Hayes walked through the dinner hall doors. She was standing inside his arm, inside the radius of the storm he had built over what she now understood had been a considerable period of time, and she was only just beginning to understand the full shape of what she was standing inside. "You planned this," she said quietly. He heard her. He turned his head slightly toward her, not far enough to look away from Edmund, but enough to indicate that he was listening. "Not all of it," he said equally quietly. "I didn't plan the seating arrangement behind the pillar. That was your mother." A muscle moved in his jaw. "That accelerated my timeline considerably." "But the rest," she said. "The debt, the holding company. You've been building this for months." "About a year," he said. "Why?" He looked at her then, fully directly with the same attention he had given her geological analysis at the dinner table. The kind of attention that made her feel like the most important source of information in the room. "Because your father has been bleeding this valley dry on borrowed money for 3 years. Because he's been leveraging his family's reputation as collateral for loans he knew he couldn't repay. Because men like Edmund Calloway depend on the assumption that no one is paying close enough attention." He paused. "And because I wanted to meet you properly." Margaret stared at him. "You purchased the controlling interest in my father's company," she said slowly, "in part because you wanted to be introduced to me." "I purchased the controlling interest in your father's company," Colton said, "because it was a sound financial decision, and because Edmund Calloway needed to be accountable for his business practices. The introduction was a secondary motivation." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Though I won't pretend it was insignificant." Dorothea had found her way to Edmund's side. She had reconstituted herself in the few minutes since the corridor, her hair repinned her expression, rearranged into something approaching control, though the control was thin and Margaret could see the terror underneath it, the way you could see dark water under river ice. Eliza was behind her, silent for once, her face carrying the particular pallor of someone who has realized that the game they thought they were playing has different rules than they understood. "Silas," Dorothea said, and then corrected immediately, "Edmund. Edmund, look at me." Edmund looked at his wife. Whatever passed between them in that look was not the communication of people who were partners. It was the communication of two people who had built an elaborate shared fiction for 30 years and were watching it disassemble itself in real time in front of an audience of their social peers. "How much?" Edmund said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that Margaret found more alarming than the shouting. "How much of it does he hold?" "The timber operation," Crane said from his careful peripheral position. "The primary household accounts at First Territorial. The grazing leases on the northern pasture. The hotel mortgage." He paused. "The mining survey loans." Edmund closed his eyes. Dorothea made a sound that Margaret had never heard from her mother before. It was small and compressed and entirely unperformed, and it contained within it the specific quality of a person who has just understood that the floor is not where they believed it to be. "You can't," Dorothea said. She turned to Colton, and the social mask was gone entirely, now stripped away, leaving something Margaret recognized with a complicated grief as simply a frightened woman. "You cannot do this. We have a family. We have a daughter." She glanced at Eliza, then back, and Margaret watched her mother's eyes slide past her without stopping. "Eliza has a future to consider. Whatever grievance you have with Edmund, it has nothing to do with our children." "No," Colton said. "It doesn't." He turned to look at Margaret for a moment, something quiet and private in his expression, and then he looked back at Dorothea. "Your eldest daughter," he said, "has a future to consider as well. You might have thought about that before you put her name on a card and hid it behind a pillar." Dorothea's eyes finally went to Margaret. Really went there, not the dismissive flicker of assessment that Margaret had been receiving her entire life, but a full frightened look. And in it, Margaret saw something she had never expected to see on her mother's face. She saw the moment Dorothea understood that Margaret was not standing beside Colton Hayes as a prop or a symbol or a business instrument. She was standing there because he had chosen her specifically and deliberately, and because she had chosen to remain. "Abigail," Dorothea said, and this time she did not correct it. The name of Margaret's dead younger sister hung in the air between them. Dorothea heard herself, and something passed across her face, a fracture quick and deep. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret, please. You are still our daughter. Whatever has happened tonight, you are still family. Speak to him. Ask him to consider—" "No, Mother," Margaret said. It came out of her the same way it had in the corridor, without heat, without performance. It was simply the truth of her stated plainly. Dorothea blinked. "What did you—" "I said no." Margaret felt the words settle into her body as she said it, filling the spaces the corset had been compressing for hours. "I will not ask him for anything on this family's behalf. The debts my father accrued are his own. The choices you made tonight are your own." She looked at her mother, and she let herself see the full complicated truth of her, the cruelty and the fear and the decades of social performance and the small terrible woman underneath all of it, and she felt a grief for that woman that she had not expected to feel. "You cannot keep me in the shadows when I embarrass you and pull me into the light when you need a shield. Not anymore." Dorothea stood entirely still. Edmund beside her had not spoken in several minutes. He looked at his eldest daughter with an expression that Margaret could not fully interpret. It was not quite remorse. It was something more complicated than that, something that required more self-awareness than Edmund Calloway had historically demonstrated, and she did not know if he was capable of completing the journey to it. Eliza said nothing. She was watching Margaret with the wide, slightly unfocused look of someone encountering a person they thought they knew, and discovering the person had been someone else entirely the whole time. The orchestra had begun a new piece quieter than the waltz, a slow and unassuming melody that had the quality of something playing in a room next door. The crowd around them was silent, held in the specific suspension of people witnessing something they will discuss for the rest of their lives. Colton looked down at Margaret. He had been still beside her through the entirety of it, not intervening, not filling the silence with his own authority, simply present at her shoulder like a mountain that had decided to stand in that particular spot and could not be moved by weather or argument. He had given her the floor and the protection to stand on it, and he had not taken either of them back. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly enough that only she could hear it. Margaret considered the question with the honest precision she applied to everything. Her ribs hurt from the corset. Her eyes were dry and slightly raw. Her hands had stopped shaking sometime in the last 20 minutes without her noticing. She was standing in the center of the Founders' Reunion Feast of Copper Ridge, Montana, in front of every person who had ever dismissed or diminished or simply not noticed her, and she had just said no to her mother for the first time in her 31 years of life. "Yes," she said, and meant it. Colton held out his hand. The night air on the ridge is something this time of year, he said. Clear enough to see the full run of stars over the peaks. I'd like to show you Ironwood if you're willing. It's a 3-hour ride up the switchbacks. He held her gaze. And I won't pretend I don't know what I'm asking. Leaving with me tonight means something. I want you to know I understand that. Margaret looked at his hand. She thought about 9 reunions and 9 corners and 9 years of place cards that carried her name to the edges of rooms. She thought about the geological journals she had read in the rain outside Hartwell's Mercantile. She thought about the aquifer data she had carried in her head for months with no one to tell it to. She thought about the moment his thumb had crossed her knuckles beneath the dinner table, and the way the soup had tasted like the first breath after a long time underwater. She put her hand in his. "I'm willing," Margaret Calloway said. They walked out of the Hargrove Grand Hotel together, through the heavy oak doors and into the cold Montana night, and the sound of the ballroom fell away behind them like something being released. The air outside was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that clarified rather than punished, carrying the smell of pine resin down from the peaks and the distant mineral scent of the Blackwood River running fast in its autumn channel. Margaret breathed it in and felt the tight architecture of the evening begin to loosen around her edges. Not dissolve. The weight of what had happened in that ballroom was not the kind of thing that dissolved in cold air. But it shifted. It became something she was carrying rather than something that was carrying her. Colton's carriage was waiting at the side of the hotel, a solid, well-built rig without ornamentation, hitched to a pair of dark horses that stood steady and patient in the November chill. The driver, an older man with a weathered face and the unhurried movements of someone who had spent decades working for a man who did not tolerate unnecessary urgency, came down from the box without being called and opened the door. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. Thomas Colton said, "We're going up to Ironwood tonight." Thomas looked at Margaret for exactly 1 second, long enough to take a reading on the situation, and then returned his attention to his employer with the professional neutrality of a man who had witnessed a great deal in 30 years of service and had learned to treat all of it as weather. "Yes, sir. Roads are clear up to the first ridge. Might be ice on the switchbacks above the tree line. Take it slow. Always do." Colton handed Margaret up into the carriage, and she settled into the seat and pulled the fur-lined blanket across her lap before she could think too carefully about what she was doing. The thinking she had decided somewhere between the dance floor and the front door could wait. She had spent 31 years thinking first, and she had ended up at a table behind a pillar. Tonight she was going to let something other than caution drive for a while and see where it took her. The carriage moved through the dark streets of Copper Ridge and began its climb toward the Bitterroot Range, and Margaret watched the town lights fall away through the window and said nothing for a long time, because she did not yet know which of the many things she was thinking deserved to be said first. Colton sat across from her. He had removed his leather coat and draped it over her side of the carriage without asking, an addition to the blanket that she accepted without protest, because the cold was real and the gesture was practical, and she was tired of refusing things from people simply to prove she did not need them. He was watching the dark outside with the comfortable attention of a man who knew this road in the way people know the routes they have traveled alone many times. "You're quiet," he said after a while. "I'm organizing," Margaret said. "Organizing what?" "Everything that happened tonight into an order I can make sense of." She looked at him across the dim interior of the carriage. "It is a considerable amount of material." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I reckon it is." "The Meridian Holding Company," she said. "How long were you planning the acquisition before you executed it?" He considered the question with the respect it deserved, which was the thing she was already beginning to identify as characteristic of him. He did not answer questions faster than he had actually thought about them. About 8 months of planning. 4 months of execution. The final purchase closed in March. "And you came to the feast tonight intending to reveal it." "I came to the feast tonight intending to meet you properly," he said. "The revelation of the Meridian position was always going to happen eventually." Your father was going to miss a debt payment in February, and the whole structure would have come out then. Tonight accelerated it. He paused. What happened with your place card accelerated it considerably. Margaret absorbed this. The carriage swayed slightly as the road began its first ascent, the horses finding their footing on the incline. You said you watched me for 3 months, she said. Outside the mercantile. The bridge argument with the telegraph operator. Yes. What else? He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much honesty the situation could hold. Then he seemed to decide it could hold all of it. I watched you carry your father's geological journals back to the library every Tuesday morning because he wouldn't send a servant for them. I watched you sit on the steps of the assay office and correct the margin calculations in the county engineer's quarterly report because he had made an error that was going to cost the valley a federal grant, and you put the corrected copy on his desk and never told anyone you'd done it. He met her eyes. I watched you be extraordinarily useful to a great many people who treated your usefulness as something they were entitled to and your existence as something they were burdened by. The words settled into Margaret with a precision that was almost painful, the specific ache of being accurately seen after a very long time of being looked past. You could have introduced yourself at the mercantile, she said, or at the library. There were simpler ways to arrange a meeting than purchasing my father's debt and appearing at the founder's feast. I could have, Colton agreed, but a simple introduction in front of Hartwell's would have lasted 30 seconds before your mother appeared and redirected you. And I needed to meet you in a context where your family's authority over your time and attention was not the governing structure of the room. The carriage took a slow curve, and the first line of dark pines closed around them. I needed to meet you somewhere they could not simply remove you from. Margaret sat with that for a moment. That is either the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, she said, or the most unsettling. It can be both, Colton said. It is both, she confirmed. He almost smiled. She was learning to read the almost smiles, the small adjustments at the corners of his mouth that were the equivalent in a man of his particular economy of expression of a full grin from someone less contained. She found she was already cataloging them the way she cataloged geological formations, noting their triggers, their variations, their relationship to the surrounding terrain. The carriage climbed for another hour before Colton leaned forward and said, There's a pull-off at the next bend. Ask Thomas to stop. She looked at him. The stars, he said simply. Thomas stopped the carriage at a wide, flat turnout carved into the side of the ridge, and Colton stepped down and held up his hand for Margaret, and she took it, and stepped out into air so cold and clear that her first breath felt like drinking from a mountain stream. And then she looked up. She had lived in the Blackwood Valley her entire life, and she had looked at the Montana sky on countless nights, but she had never looked at it from here, from this elevation, from a place where the valley lights were far enough below that they did not compete. The stars were not merely present. They were structural dense and layered the Milky Way, a literal river of light running from peak to peak overhead, with a depth and texture she had never seen from the valley floor. She stood with her head tipped back and said nothing for a long time, and Colton stood beside her and did not say anything either, and the silence between them was of the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling. I used to read about the elevation effect on atmospheric clarity, she said finally, in the Denver journals, the reduction in light scattering above the tree line. I understood it theoretically. Different from seeing it, Colton said. Entirely different, she agreed. She lowered her head and found him watching her with that particular quality of attention she was still learning to sit inside without reflexively deflecting it. She had spent so many years managing the experience of being looked at disparagingly that she had no practiced response for being looked at the way he looked at her. It required an entirely different set of skills that she did not yet possess and would apparently have to develop from nothing. Colton, she said. Yes. What happens Monday morning? The question was practical and necessary, and she had been holding it since the ballroom. When your attorney contacts my father, what does the process actually look like? What does my family lose, and over what period of time? He did not look away or soften the question. The timber operation goes into receivership within 30 days. The household accounts at First Territorial get restructured. Your father keeps his personal clothing and his personal effects and the small property on the East Road that's held in your mother's name from before the marriage. It's not in the Meridian portfolio. He paused. They will not be destitute. They will not be comfortable. They will have to live within their actual means for the first time in 15 years. And Harlan's grazing leases get called in February as scheduled. He has options if he's willing to negotiate in good faith. Whether he's capable of that remains to be seen. Margaret nodded slowly. She was building the picture in her mind the same way she built topographic models from survey data, assembling the shape of things from their component measurements. The shape that was assembling itself was one she would not have been able to imagine 24 hours ago. Her family diminished, accountable, forced into the ordinary life they had always treated as beneath them. She waited for the guilt to arrive. She had been raised on guilt, the way some children were raised on bread and milk, the constant low-grade instruction that her primary obligation was to absorb the consequences of the family's choices and convert them through her own suffering into something manageable for the people around her. The guilt did not arrive. What arrived instead was something quieter and more complicated, a grief for the versions of her family that had never quite materialized. The mother who might have been someone different without the architecture of social ambition encasing her. The father who might have been someone worth knowing if he had not spent 30 years performing wealth he was borrowing. And underneath the grief, something that felt cautiously and unexpectedly like relief. "I want to ask you something," Colton said. "And I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is one you think I don't want to hear." "All right," Margaret said. "Are you afraid of me?" She considered the question with genuine care, turning it over the way she turned over rock samples, examining its faces. "No," she said. "I find you unpredictable, which is adjacent to unsettling, but is not the same thing as frightening. You are considerably more deliberate than you appear, which I respect, but which also means I am aware that I do not yet have full visibility into how you operate." She looked at him. "I am not afraid of you. I am aware that I don't fully know you." "That's fair," he said. "Are you afraid of me?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was deciding whether to answer honestly or deflect into something easier. Then he said, "A little." She had not expected that. "Why?" "Because you're the first person I've met in a long time who might actually be able to tell when I'm wrong," he said. "And mean it, and not back down from it." He looked at the sky for a moment. "That's not a comfortable thing to have in close proximity. It's a valuable thing, but it takes some getting used to." Margaret stood in the cold Montana dark on the side of a mountain with a man who had dismantled her family's empire and called her magnificent and admitted to being slightly afraid of her capacity for accuracy, and she thought that the Blackwood Valley had never felt less like a place she was trapped in and more like a place she was choosing. They reached Ironwood an hour later. She had expected something rougher given the town's mythology about the mountain man who lived like a recluse in the peaks. What she found instead was a house that had been built by someone with both resources and a specific personal idea of what a home should be. Stone and cedar warm light from several windows, smoke from 3 chimneys, moving straight up in the still cold air. The proportions were generous without being excessive. It sat against the mountain with the settled confidence of a structure that intended to remain. Inside, a housekeeper named Mrs. Aldrich met them in the entrance hall, with the professional calm of a woman who had been informed that a guest might be arriving and had prepared accordingly a room with a fire, a tray with tea and bread, the practical courtesies of a household that operated smoothly because its management had been thought through. Margaret noted this. A man who ran his household well was a man who understood that the details of daily life were not beneath consideration. Mrs. Aldrich withdrew and Colton led Margaret to the room adjacent to the main hall, and Margaret stopped walking when she saw it. 2 full floors of books, rolling ladders. Maps spread across mahogany tables with the comfortable disorder of materials in active use rather than display. Geological surveys with notations in the margins. Architectural plans for what appeared to be a rail switching station. A leather chair positioned beside a reading lamp at an angle that suggested it was used for hours at a time by someone who took the reading seriously. She walked into the room without speaking. She moved along the shelves with her fingers trailing the spines the way she had always wanted to move through rooms full of books, but had learned early that her mother found the behavior embarrassing in social contexts. She found engineering texts and philosophical works, and the full run of the Denver Geological Review going back 12 years, and a section of medical journals, and 3 shelves of literature in languages she recognized without being able to read. "These are working books," she said. "You've read all of these." "Most of them," Colton said from the doorway. He had his shoulder against the frame, his arms loose at his sides, watching her move through his library with an expression she would have needed better light to fully read. "Some of them twice. The margin notes in the geological surveys. Mine, yes." She pulled one from the shelf and opened it and looked at his handwriting in the margins. It was compact and direct, the handwriting of someone who wrote for utility rather than impression. And the notes were substantive questions, more often than conclusions, the marginalia of a mind that engaged with what it read, rather than simply consuming it. "You've been working alone up here," she said. "For a long time, yes." She put the survey back carefully. She turned to face him. He had not moved from the doorway, and she understood suddenly that he was waiting for something, not with impatience, but with the particular attentiveness of a man who has learned that the most important moments do not benefit from being rushed. "You said at dinner that it had been lonely," she said, "having no one to debate the theories with." "I did." "You meant it." "I meant everything I said to you tonight," he said. "That has been my policy throughout." She stood in the middle of his library with her hands at her sides and the emerald gown that her mother had chosen to minimize her in, and the hairpins that had been digging into her scalp since 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And she looked at the man in the doorway, who had spent months watching her from a careful distance, and then had walked into the Founder's Feast and burned the whole careful structure of her captivity to the ground. "The hairpins are giving me a headache," she said. It was not what she had intended to say. It arrived before the more composed version of her thoughts, and delivered itself without her permission, bare and domestic, and entirely without the social grace she had been trained to maintain. Colton pushed off the doorframe and crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for one moment, and she did not step back. He reached up, and with a deliberateness that made each small action legible, he began to find the pins in her hair, one at a time, dropping them onto the nearest reading table with small metallic sounds that were somehow the most intimate thing she had ever heard. Her dark hair came down in stages, heavy and unruly, and entirely her own, falling past her shoulders in the way her mother had been pinning it back from since she was 16 years old. She felt the headache release. She felt something else release alongside it, something larger and less easily named. Colton held the last pin between his fingers and looked at her, and his expression was so entirely unguarded that she felt she was seeing him without the mountain man armor for the first time, seeing the actual man who had built a stone house on a ridge and filled it with books and waited for a long time for someone to come debate the theories with. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it." "When the Chicago banking men come Monday to contest your acquisition," she said, "and they will come, Fletcher Crane does not work alone, and the Meridian purchase will be challenged the moment his former associates understand what he agreed to have you prepared the legal documentation thoroughly enough to withstand a federal review." Colton went very still. "Yes," he said slowly. "I believe so." "Which federal land ordinances are you using to anchor the subterranean mineral rights on the Northern Survey?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved to the reading table and spread out a set of documents she had not previously noticed beneath the geological surveys, legal papers dense with territorial statutes and property claims, and she leaned over them in the lamplight with her hair loose around her shoulders and began to read. 3 minutes later, she stopped. She straightened. She felt the cold certainty of a calculation error settling into her stomach. "Colton," she said carefully, "the 1869 Mineral Rights Act. You've cited Section 4, subsection C, to anchor your claim on the silver vein running under the north pasture." "That's correct," he said. "Section 4, subsection C was amended in 1877, she said. The amendment created an exception for pre-existing water access claims. The Callaway family filed a water access claim on the North Pasture Spring in 1871. She looked up at him. If Crane's former associates know about the amendment, and if they have access to the 1871 water claim filing, they can use it to argue that the mineral rights anchor is invalid. They can potentially unwind the entire northern acquisition. The room was very quiet. Colton looked at the documents. He looked at her. The expression on his face was not the collapse of a man whose plan had failed. It was the recalibration of a man encountering a problem he had not previously identified and immediately beginning to calculate the solution. "Can it be countered?" he asked. "Possibly," Margaret said. She was already pulling geological surveys from the shelf, cross-referencing them against the legal documents with the focused intensity that had always embarrassed her family and had never once embarrassed her. The 1877 amendment has a secondary clause. If the mineral rights acquisition predates the water claim by establishment of use rather than formal filing, the amendment exception doesn't apply. She looked at his survey maps. "When did you first begin extracting copper from that vein?" 1879, he said. "But the formal filing isn't what matters. The establishment of use is what matters." She straightened. "Do you have records of the 1879 extraction? Assay reports, worker payroll ledgers, supply purchase receipts from that period?" "In the archive room," Colton said, already moving toward the door at the far end of the library. "Then we have work to do," Margaret said. She pushed her loose hair back from her face with one hand and followed him, her heels on the stone floor. Her mind already 3 steps ahead of the documents, building the argument from its foundations, shoring it up against every angle of attack she could anticipate. She heard Colton stop walking. She looked up from her own momentum to find him standing in the archive doorway, turned back toward her, and the expression on his face was the one she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the dramatic ardor of the ballroom. It was quieter than that and more durable. It was the face of a man watching someone step fully and without reservation into the space that had been waiting for them. "Margaret," he said. "We have until Monday morning," she said. "That is approximately 40 hours. If we work tonight, we can have a preliminary counter-argument documented by dawn." "Yes," he said, and then quietly, "Thank you." She did not tell him that she had never in her life been thanked for her mind, as though it were a gift rather than an inconvenience. She filed the feeling away carefully in the place where she kept things that were too important to expose to the open air before she had properly understood them. "Show me the archive," she said. The archive room was smaller than the library and considerably more lived in. The kind of space that accumulates its character from use rather than intention. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls packed with ledgers and deed boxes and bound survey reports, organized by year rather than subject the filing system of a man who thought chronologically and retrieved information by timeline. A long wooden work table occupied the center of the room with a lamp at each end and a third one on a swinging arm that could be repositioned for close work. It smelled of paper and cedar and the particular dry cold of a room that held its temperature separate from the rest of the house. Margaret went directly to the shelves and began reading spines. She was not browsing. She was executing a search pattern, moving left to right, top to bottom. The same systematic approach she applied to every body of information, beginning with the overall architecture, before reaching for individual documents. Colton watched her for approximately 30 seconds before he understood that observation was not what was needed, and moved to the opposite end of the shelves to do the same. "The 1879 payroll ledgers," she said. "What color are the bindings? What did you use for that period?" "Brown leather brass corner pieces. The extraction records are in a separate box. Black lacquer should be on the third shelf from the bottom in the 1875 to 1882 section." She found it in 4 minutes. She carried it to the work table and opened it and began reading with the focused speed of someone who had trained themselves to extract relevant information from dense primary sources, scanning rather than reading, her eyes moving in the specific pattern of a person who knows precisely what they are looking for. "Here," she said. She pressed her finger to a line in the third column of the October 1879 extraction report. "First recorded copper yield from the North Vein, dated October 14, 1879, signed by the site foreman and countersigned by the assay officer at Helena." She moved to another page. "And here, November payroll for 12 miners, specifically assigned to the North Vein site. Names, daily rates, total disbursement." She looked up. "This establishes continuous use of the mineral rights from October 1879. The Callaway water claim on the North Pasture Spring was filed in the spring of 1871, but the water claim filing does not establish mineral rights extraction use. Your copper extraction predates any challenge to those rights by the terms of the 1877 Amendment's secondary clause." Colton had come around the table and was reading over her shoulder. His presence at her back was a warmth she was beginning to accept as simply part of the geography of the room. "But Crane's associates will argue the formal mineral rights filing date," he said, "not the extraction date." "They will," Margaret agreed, "which is why we need to find the territorial precedent." She was already back at the shelves. "The Colorado case, 1883 or 1884, I believe. A mining operation in Pueblo County argued establishment of use against a competing formal filing. The territorial court ruled in favor of demonstrated use over documentation date." She turned. "Do you have the Colorado Territorial Court records? The Mining Division opinions?" Colton crossed to a wooden deed box on the second shelf, sorted through it, pulled a bound volume. He carried it to the table and opened it beside her extracted documents, and they worked alongside each other in the lamplight without speaking for nearly an hour, the room quiet except for the occasional turn of a page, and the small sounds of the house settling in the cold. At some point, Mrs. Aldrich appeared in the doorway with a tray and set it on the corner of the work table without comment, and disappeared again. Margaret drank the tea without looking up from the Pueblo County opinion she was annotating in the margins, with a pencil she had found in the center drawer of the work table, writing in the cramped, rapid hand of someone thinking faster than their hand wants to cooperate with. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, she set down the pencil and straightened and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at what they had assembled. "It holds," she said. "The establishment of use argument holds against the 1877 Amendment challenge. The Pueblo precedent is directly applicable. The extraction dates are documented and countersigned. The payroll records provide secondary corroboration." She organized the pages into a coherent stack. "A competent territorial attorney can build a motion to dismiss from this material. The challenge fails if it's properly argued." Colton stood beside her looking at the assembled documents. "You found this in 4 hours. The information was already here," she said. "It just needed to be connected in the right order." "My attorney has been managing this case for 8 months, Colton said. "He did not find this." "Your attorney was looking for what he expected the challenge to be," Margaret said. "I was looking for what it could be. Those are different searches." Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to understand that the question stands entirely independent of everything that happened tonight. Independent of your family's situation, independent of the business, independent of any obligation you may feel exists because of how this evening went." She turned to face him. "I would like you to stay at Ironwood," he said. "Not tonight only, permanently, as my wife." He held her gaze with the directness she had come to understand was simply how he was built. No performance in it, no cushioning. "I have been alone on this mountain for a long time, and I have done it well enough. But tonight, I watched you walk into a room full of people who had spent years diminishing you, and I watched you stand in the middle of it and say no to your mother and mean it, and then I watched you spend 4 hours in a cold archive room saving my legal position because you saw a problem I had missed and you could not let it go unaddressed. The almost smile came, and this time it was full enough to be unambiguous. I do not want to be alone on this mountain anymore, and I do not believe you want to go back to the valley. Margaret stood on the other side of the work table from him and looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she was being asked and what it would mean. Not romantically, not in the immediate warmth of the lamplight and the shared work and the cold mountain air, but with the clear, analytical precision she had always applied to important decisions when she was honest with herself. She was 31 years old. She had no income of her own, no property of her own. Her family's financial structure was about to collapse, and whatever modest security she might have claimed through the Calloway name was dissolving. She had no suitors. She had no reasonable prospect of independent establishment. She was also the most mentally alive she had been in 31 years. She had spent 4 hours doing work that mattered, work that had consequences, work that a man of considerable intelligence and resources had needed done and could not do himself. She had sat at a table and been listened to. She had said no to her mother in public, and the ceiling had not come down. She allowed herself to observe in a room with a man who had removed her hairpins with the careful attention other men gave to delicate instruments, and who had admitted to being slightly afraid of her capacity for accuracy, and who had said, "I want a partner with the simple conviction of a man stating a geographical fact." "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Satisfaction may be the look of a man who has made a prediction that has been confirmed. "I'd expect nothing less." "The archive," she said. "And the library. Full access ongoing. I am not going to become a decorative feature of this household. I need to be able to work." "The library and archive are yours," he said immediately. "All of it." The Denver Geological Review subscription continues. I'll add the Helena Mining Journal and the Chicago Engineering Quarterly. "I will have opinions about your business decisions," she said. "I will express them. I will be correct a statistically significant portion of the time, and I will not apologize for that." "I am counting on it," he said. "That is in fact a foundational element of the proposal." She looked at him. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I did not expect to be asked," she said honestly. "Not tonight, not by anyone. I had largely concluded that the particular configuration of qualities I possess was not one the world was prepared to make room for." She paused. "You made room." "You were already taking up the right amount of space," Colton said. "I just moved the furniture that was in the way." Margaret looked at the assembled legal documents on the table between them, the careful architecture of protection she had built in 4 hours for a man she had known for less than 12. She looked at the shelves of working books with their marginal notes, and the lamp on its adjustable arm positioned for someone who read for long hours and took it seriously. She looked at the window where the first pale suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate the mountain peaks from the sky, the night releasing its hold on the ridge with the reluctant slowness of a long Montana winter finally conceding to spring. She walked around the work table. She stopped in front of him. "Yes," Margaret Calloway said. He reached out and took her hand, and this time it was not the formal offered palm of the ballroom or the steadying anchor beneath the dinner table. He simply held her hand in his, her fingers against the calluses and small scars of his palm, and the simplicity of it was more than everything that had come before it. They were married 6 weeks later in a ceremony attended by Thomas the driver. Mrs. Aldrich, a territorial judge named Beaumont, who owed Colton Hayes 3 years of professional courtesy, and the Ironwood Estate's 2 ranch hands who had drawn the short straws for witness duty, and considered it the most interesting afternoon of their working lives. No one from Copper Ridge was invited. This was not an oversight. The legal challenge from Crane's former associates arrived as Margaret had anticipated on the Tuesday following the Founders Feast. It was filed in territorial court by a Chicago law firm with an impressive letterhead and a fundamental misunderstanding of the 1877 Mineral Rights Act Amendment's secondary clause. Colton's attorney, armed with the motion to dismiss that Margaret had drafted from the archive documents on the night of the feast, filed the counter-argument on Thursday morning. The challenge was dismissed without hearing in January. The attorney wrote to Colton afterward to say it was the cleanest dismissal motion he had seen in 20 years of territorial practice and asked who had prepared the foundational research. Colton wrote back that it had been his wife. The attorney wrote again to ask whether Mrs. Hayes had any interest in consulting work. Margaret replied directly to that letter, and the correspondence that followed eventually established a professional arrangement that would occupy a meaningful portion of her working hours for the next decade. Edmund Calloway lost the timber operation in February as scheduled. He took a position managing accounts for a smaller lumber merchant on the east side of the valley, a man he had publicly condescended to at 3 consecutive Founders' Feasts. And the particular quality of that irony was not lost on anyone in Copper Ridge, who had been in the Hargrove Grand Hotel on the night of the feast. Dorothea moved into the East Road property that the Meridian acquisition had not touched, because it was held in her name from before the marriage, and because Colton had made a deliberate decision not to reach for it. Margaret knew about that decision. She had not asked him to make it. He had made it without discussion, and when she found out through the legal documents, she did not remark on it, and he did not explain it. And that particular form of communication became one of the foundational dialects of their marriage. Harlan negotiated his grazing lease terms in March with the motivated good faith of a man who had recently had the limits of his authority demonstrated to him in front of 200 people. The terms were fair. Colton did not believe in extracting more than a situation warranted, and the lease renegotiation was a business matter rather than a punishment. Eliza married a rancher from the Judith Basin in the spring. He was not wealthy by Copper Ridge standards, but he was decent and hard-working, and he looked at Eliza the way people deserved to be looked at. And when Margaret heard about the marriage through a letter from Thomas, who maintained a quiet network of valley information, the way some men maintained vegetable gardens, she felt something she chose to identify as genuine goodwill toward her sister, and left it at that. The Blackwood Valley changed in the years that followed, not dramatically and not all at once, but in the incremental way that real change operates one decision and one season at a time. The northern passes that Colton controlled opened the high country to legitimate development in ways that the previous system of debt and leveraged expansion had been too unstable to sustain. Margaret's work on the legal framework for the mineral rights holdings established precedents that shaped territorial property law for a generation. She was never formally credited in the legal opinions. That did not particularly bother her. The work was correct. The work held. That was sufficient. What she had not anticipated, and what she later considered the most significant miscalculation of the many calculations she had made on the night of the Founders' Feast, was how much she would come to love the mountain itself. She had expected to love the library, and she did. She had expected to love the work, and she did. She had not expected to love the specific quality of silence that lived above the tree line in early morning, when the valley was still wrapped in its own weather, and the ridge stood clear and cold above it, or the way the light changed on the peaks through the seasons, with a precision that she could track against the geological surveys, and find accurate every time the mountain doing exactly what the data said it would do reliably and without apology. She had not expected to love the man the way she came to love him, with the same quality of attention she brought to everything she cared about, thorough and particular, and continuously updated as new information arrived. He was not simple. He had the interior complexity of a person who had spent many years alone with his own thoughts, and had done real work on them, and the conversations that unfolded over years of shared meals and shared archive rooms and shared rides down the switchbacks into the valley were the best conversations of her life. He was wrong about things with a frequency that she found both useful and endearing. He told her when she was wrong with a directness that she had once believed she would find intolerable in a person and discovered she found necessary. On a morning in early spring, nearly 2 years after the night of the Founders' Feast, Margaret stood on the cedar balcony of Ironwood with a cup of tea in her hands and the Denver Geological Review open on the railing beside her, weighted against the wind with a smooth piece of granite she had picked up on the lower trail the previous autumn because its specific composition was interesting. The valley below was beginning to show the first pale green of new growth along the river channels, and the snow on the upper peaks was pulling back from the tree line in the measured retreat of an ordinary spring following an ordinary winter. She heard Colton's step behind her before she heard the door. She had learned his movement in the house the way you learn the sounds of a place you intend to remain in. He came to stand beside her, his arm settling around her waist, with the easiness of long habit, his chin finding the space above her shoulder. He looked out at the valley for a moment, in the comfortable silence that had become the primary weather of their shared life. "The Pueblo lawyers wrote again," he said. "They want a consultation on the amended water rights question." "I saw the letter," Margaret said. "I'll reply this afternoon. There's no urgency." "I know. I want to." She felt him nod against her hair. She picked up the Geological Review and turned a page. "The aquifer survey results came back from the Helena office," she said. "The east vein projection was correct. The copper yield will be significantly higher than the initial estimate." "How much higher?" 30% conservatively. 40 if the secondary deposit extends as far north as the 1882 survey suggests. She turned another page. "I'd like to do an updated field survey of the secondary site before we commit to the expanded extraction plan. The Helena office is using the old mapping equipment, and I don't trust the margin of error on the depth readings." "I'll arrange it," he said. "When do you want to go?" "Next week if the weather holds." "It'll hold," he said. "The pressure system coming off the peaks has been stable for 4 days. We have another week at least." She looked out at the peaks he had described, reading them the way he had taught her to read weather in the high country, the specific language of cloud formation and wind direction, and the color of the light at the horizon that told a person what the next 3 days would bring. She had not known any of that on the night she arrived at Ironwood. She knew it now, and she knew it well, and she was aware that she would spend the rest of her life in a place that continued to teach her things she had not known she needed to learn. She put her hand over his at her waist. "Colton," she said. The night of the feast. If my name had been on the place card. If my mother had seated me at the head table as she was supposed to, and everything had proceeded ordinarily. Would you still have introduced yourself?" He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man giving a question the full weight it deserved. "I'd been watching you for 3 months," he said. "I'd already decided. I would have found a way to speak to you that evening regardless." He paused. "It would have taken considerably longer, though, and been less interesting." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, and leaned back against the solid warmth of him, and looked out at the valley that had once felt like a place she could not escape, and had become from this elevation simply a place she had come from. She had arrived at Ironwood with loose hair and borrowed documents and 31 years of accumulated smallness, and she had spent 2 years methodically setting all of it down, not because Colton Hayes had rescued her from it, but because she had been ready to set it down, and he had stood beside her and held the floor steady while she did. She was not the girl who had walked the length of the head table looking for a name that was not there. She was not the woman who had stood frozen in the center aisle, unable to move in either direction. She was Margaret Hayes, and she worked at a mahogany table surrounded by geological surveys, and she argued territorial law in correspondence with attorneys who had initially addressed their letters to her husband, and she read the Denver Geological Review cover to cover on the cedar balcony every month when it arrived, and she knew the name of every star visible from the Ironwood Ridge on a clear November night. She had taken up exactly the amount of space she had always occupied. The world had simply finally arranged itself correctly around her. And on the mountain above the Blackwood Valley, with the spring light moving across the peaks, and the sound of the river running far below, and the man who had chosen her standing at her back without condition or reservation. Margaret Calloway. Hayes looked out over everything that had tried to hold her small and understood with the clear and lasting certainty of a woman who has learned to trust her own calculations, that she had never once been too much. She had always been exactly enough.